"I never want kids," Millionaire CEO said. She left, pregnant. 5 years later, he found her, with twins. The bell above the cafe door rang with a thin, tired sound, like it hadn't expected anyone to enter at all. Derek Wolfe barely noticed it. His mind was still stuck on the roadside, on the steam bleeding from his stalled luxury car, on the ridiculous fact that a man who could buy a fleet of vehicles was now at the mercy of a mechanic who might show up sometime before evening. He stepped inside, mostly to kill time. The cafe was modest, not trendy, not Instagram famous. Just a row of mismatched tables, a chalkboard menu written by hand that didn't care about perfection, and the soft murmur of locals who all seemed to know each other. He ordered coffee he wouldn't finish. Then he turned. At the corner table near the window sat a woman he hadn't seen in 5 years, yet had never truly stopped seeing. Mayra. Her hair was longer now, gathered loosely at the back of her neck. Her face carried a calm that hadn't existed before, a kind of grounded ease that made her look like she finally belonged somewhere. She was laughing. Not the polite corporate kind, but the unguarded kind that bends the body forward without asking permission. Across from her were 2 boys. They were nearly identical. Same dark curls, same crooked grins. One was tugging at a muffin as if it were a contested prize. The other was lecturing him with authority far too serious for someone who couldn't yet reach the table without climbing the chair. Derek stopped walking. The cafe noise faded into something distant, as though he'd slipped underwater. His hand tightened around the paper cup until heat bit into his palm, but he didn't feel it, because they had his eyes. Not the color, the shape, the weight behind them. The alert, guarded curiosity that he recognized instantly. The same look he'd once seen in the mirror after sleepless nights before investor meetings. It was there, staring back at him from 2 small faces that had never known his name. One of the boys glanced up first. He stared openly, chewing forgotten, eyes narrowing with the blunt assessment only children allow themselves. The second followed, then nudged his brother, whispering something Derek couldn't hear. Myra looked up last. Her laughter ended mid-breath. For a moment, no one moved. Her face didn't twist with shock. It didn't crumble with pain. It simply closed, the way doors close in expensive buildings, quietly, efficiently, without invitation. Derek's mind searched for something to do with his hands. He set the coffee down without knowing where the table was. It sloshed, brown liquid creeping toward the edge, but still he didn't move. 5 years. 5 years of keynote speeches, magazine covers, airport lounges, deals closed over wine he didn't taste. 5 years telling himself that silence was peace. And here, in a town he'd never meant to visit, stood the life he'd pretended not to imagine. One of the boys leaned closer to his mother. "Mom," he said, not bothering to whisper. "That man looks like us." A few heads turned. Someone near the counter laughed softly, thinking it was nothing more than a child's blunt observation. Myra's jaw tightened. She rose slowly, as if sudden movement might cause something fragile to shatter. "You weren't supposed to find me," she said. Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there are moments when language isn't late. It simply refuses to arrive at all. He had rehearsed answers for investors. He had spoken calmly while companies rose or collapsed under his decisions. Yet standing there, watched by 2 children who shared his face, his mouth failed him. "I didn't even know I was looking," he managed finally. The boy who had spoken earlier slid off his chair and stood on the seat, his eyes level with Derek's chest. "You famous?" he asked. Derek shook his head once, unsure whether it was meant as a lie or a confession. The boy tilted his head. "Then why do you look scared?" Myra placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. "Sit down, Alexis." The name landed heavier than any accusation. Derek repeated it silently, trying to anchor himself to something real. The other twin leaned across the table, studying him as though he were a puzzle with missing pieces. "You really do look like us," he said, "but taller." Derek's throat tightened. "I think I do," he replied. Myra met his eyes then, fully, and something flickered there. Not hope, not anger, but recognition of a past that refused to stay buried. "We should go," she said to the boys, already gathering napkins, the muffin forgotten. Derek stepped forward before he knew he had decided to move. "Myra," he said, softly enough that only she would hear. She paused, not because she wanted to, but because some truths don't allow clean exits. Outside, the small-town traffic passed like it always had, unaware that a man who had once declared his future with certainty had just seen it sitting at a chipped wooden table, swinging its legs and asking why he looked afraid. The first time Derek said them, he didn't think they mattered. They slipped out during a televised interview in New York, under studio lights so bright they erased nuance. The host had been smiling, the way people smile when they're about to ask something personal but safe. "Do you ever see yourself becoming a father one day?" she asked, voice warm, audience leaning in. Derek laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter had become his shield, a reflex to anything that slowed him down. "I never want kids," he said. 6 words, calm, clean, final. The audience clapped. His PR manager gave him a thumbs up from off camera. The host nodded approvingly, already pivoting to the next topic. What the cameras didn't catch was Myra, standing at the back of the studio near the exit, the way she always did when she visited. She preferred not to be seen, not to become part of the story. She had come straight from the doctor's office, her purse still heavy with papers she hadn't yet unfolded. She had planned to tell him that night, not with drama. Just over dinner, maybe in that tiny Italian place he loved before reservations became impossible. She had practiced the opening line all the way there. "We're going to need a bigger table." When the words left his mouth, they didn't strike her like a blow. They pressed into her slowly, as though the room itself were losing air. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She simply stood there while strangers celebrated a future that erased hers. Back in the cafe, Derek heard the echo of that applause in his ears, louder than the clink of dishes, louder than the quiet town traffic outside. "I never want kids." He watched Alexis fold his napkin into a crooked triangle, watched Fidel lick sugar from his fingers, watched the way they leaned toward Myra when she stood, the way orbit belongs to gravity. Those 6 words had not been a boundary. They'd been a door slammed so hard it changed the shape of everything that came after. For years he remembered that interview as a professional win, a clean answer, a confident stance, a soundbite that fit neatly into the brand he had built. Now he understood it differently. He hadn't been answering a question about fatherhood. He had been announcing who he refused to become, and he had done it while the woman carrying his children stood 10 feet away, learning in real time that love could be edited out of a life with applause. There are moments that don't arrive with warnings. They don't carry sirens or headlines. They look ordinary on the outside. A laugh in the studio, a question asked too casually, a man answering too quickly because speed has always kept him safe. Derek used to believe his life was built on strategy, that nothing important ever happened by accident. But standing in that cafe, watching 2 boys share the same restless energy that once powered his 20-hour workdays, he realized something far more dangerous than failure had been hiding in plain sight. The most expensive mistake he had ever made didn't come from a bad deal. It came from a sentence he didn't even remember saying until it came back with faces that stared at him with open curiosity, not knowing he had already decided their place in his world before they had taken their first breath. This was not a story about money. It was not about ambition or career choices or even romance. It was about the single moment when a man convinces himself that control is strength, and only later discovers that control, when taken too far, is another word for abandonment. Derek had mastered everything except the courage to let his life become bigger than his fears. Have you ever walked away from something that scared you, only to realize later it wasn't danger you were escaping, it was responsibility? Have you ever made a choice that felt logical in the moment, only to watch its shadow stretch across years you thought were secure? Think about it. How many times have people said things like, "Now isn't the right time, I'll deal with that later. I just need to focus on myself," believing they're protecting their future, while quietly carving pieces out of it? Derek had lived inside those phrases for most of his adult life. They were neat, professional, defensible. Yet none of them prepared him for the way 2 children could dismantle an entire identity with nothing more than a question and a shared look. Because the real danger is not in the choices we regret. It is in the choices we defend for so long that we forget they were ever choices at all. Derek had always described himself as decisive. That was the word investors loved. It implied clarity, authority, a man who didn't hesitate when the numbers demanded blood. But fear is not always loud. Sometimes it dresses as discipline. He hadn't rejected fatherhood because he lacked love. He rejected it because it threatened the one thing he trusted more than people: structure. A child cannot be scheduled into quarterly projections. You cannot silence needs with a deadline. In boardrooms, he had learned how to dominate chaos. In life, he had mistaken that skill for maturity. The truth sat across from him now. kicking chair legs and arguing over crumbs, reminding him that the one responsibility he had never learned to carry was the one that required him to stay when staying offered no applause at all. What Derek still didn't know, as he stood there watching Mayra gather her sons and prepare to leave, was how close he had come to repeating the same mistake all over again. Because the story didn't end when she walked out 5 years earlier. It deepened. It hid in medical forms she folded into purses, in birthday candles blown out without him, in questions small boys stopped asking when answers never came. And somewhere inside those lost years was a moment, a single fragile moment, when the future could have bent in a different direction. He would only discover it after learning how much of himself he had already given away. If you've ever said something that felt harmless at the time, only to realize later that it shaped everything that followed, you're not alone in this story. Before we go any further, take a second to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to Mr. Cooper Stories. These real-life inspired narratives are about the moments we all think we can outrun until they catch up to us. And stay with me, because the truth behind why Mayra left without looking back will challenge the way you think about control, courage, and what it really means to choose a life. Derek Wolfe did not wake up one morning and decide to become a man who outran attachment. He was trained into it long before he learned what the word meant. His father was not cruel. That would have been easier to explain. He was exacting, a former accountant who measured love in results. School projects were graded twice, once by teachers, once at the kitchen table. 95% was not excellence. It was proximity to excellence, and proximity was never enough. Mistakes were not punished with anger. They were met with silence, a look over the top of wire-rimmed glasses, a pause long enough to teach a child that disappointment could weigh more than shouting ever could. By 12, Derek had learned the equation. Approval arrived only after performance. Emotion, when expressed freely, invited uncertainty, and uncertainty led to that quiet, heavy absence at the dinner table. His mother tried to soften it. She packed notes into his lunchbox with crooked hearts and small reminders to breathe. But she worked double shifts at the hospital, and presence is not something that can be outsourced. What stayed with Derek wasn't discipline. It was the awareness that affection was conditional. So he adapted. He learned to anticipate expectations before they were spoken, to excel before being asked, to present answers without showing the questions forming behind his eyes. The reward for this was consistency, not warmth, but reliability. And reliability felt close enough to safety. By high school, he was already running clubs he didn't enjoy and competitions he didn't need, not because he wanted the trophies, but because he had learned that motion protected him from inspection. When he was busy, no one noticed that he didn't know how to ask for comfort. This was the foundation of the man who would one day sit across from his own children and not know how to reach for them. By the time Derek left for college, pressure no longer felt imposed. It felt chosen. He scheduled every hour of his day the way other students scheduled classes. Workouts at dawn. Lectures recorded so he could replay them at double speed. Group projects he quietly carried on his back because trusting others meant allowing variables. Roommates joked that he treated life like a series of transactions. They weren't wrong. Derek didn't collect friends. He assembled alliances not out of arrogance but out of instinct. People were unpredictable. Systems were not. Whenever anxiety brushed too close to the surface, he tightened his grip. A new goal, a new metric, a new benchmark that promised certainty if he could just hit it. The more his world demanded of him, the more he retreated into precision. He believed order was not simply efficient, it was protective. If everything was accounted for, nothing could surprise him. Nothing could ask for something he hadn't already decided how to give. Derek's first startup didn't succeed because he had a revolutionary idea. It succeeded because he refused to be ordinary. He slept in the office during the early months, not out of desperation but conviction. There was a purity in that sacrifice, a clarity that came when personal needs were treated as negotiable. Investors noticed. So did the press. By 29, articles referred to him as relentless. The word followed him like a badge. He wore it well, speaking about vision and discipline with the polished confidence of someone who had rehearsed himself into existence. The persona hardened with every success. The man who once struggled to ask for comfort now stood on stages telling others how to build resilience, how to strip weakness from ambition. His life became a case study, his choices a blueprint others tried to copy. He didn't see the danger in this until much later. When a role is applauded often enough, it replaces the person who first stepped into it. At the top of the tower, Derek owned a home that never felt owned. The penthouse had walls of glass, a view that bent the skyline into a private exhibit. There was a kitchen that had never learned the smell of cooking, and a guest room that waited for visitors who rarely stayed. Every object was selected by a designer who asked what image he wanted to project. He answered without hesitation: minimal, modern, unencumbered. But at night, when the city softened into distant noise, the space turned against him. Sound carried too far. Light felt exposed. He often left the television running just to create the illusion of company. He told himself this was the cost of achievement, that solitude was a luxury misunderstood by those who had never earned it. Only later would he understand that the penthouse was not a reward. It was a monument to everything he had kept out. One afternoon, months after the cafe, Derek found himself on a park bench while Alexis and Fidel attempted to outdo each other on the monkey bars. Alexis made it halfway before losing his grip, dropping into the sand with exaggerated drama. Fidel applauded loudly, already preparing his own performance. Neither noticed Derek watching, as if this were a rare language he was still learning to translate. When Alexis stood, brushing sand from his knees, he glanced over and caught Derek staring. "What?" he asked. Derek hesitated. "Nothing. Just, you look happy." Alexis frowned, considering this as though it were an odd claim. We're just playing. Derek leaned back against the bench, the sound of their laughter cutting through him in a way quarterly reports never could. It was not loud or remarkable. It was simply alive, the kind of sound no achievement ever taught him how to make. The building was almost empty when Myra first spoke to him. Not because she had planned to. She had stayed late finishing a set of onboarding documents, the kind no one ever praised but everyone relied on. By the time she shut down her computer, the office had fallen into that hollow stillness reserved for people who mistake exhaustion for purpose. Derek was in the glass conference room at the end of the hall, the only light still burning. His jacket hung over the back of a chair. His sleeves were rolled just high enough to show the tension in his forearms as he leaned over his laptop, fingers hovering but not moving. She might have passed by if he hadn't rubbed his face in frustration, a small human gesture that didn't belong to the legend people were already whispering about. "You look like someone who forgot what sleep is," she said. He didn't turn. "I don't need sympathy." "Good," she replied lightly. "I didn't bring any." That made him look up. She stood in the doorway holding a folder like a peace offering, her expression open in a way the office didn't encourage. He waited for her to leave, but she didn't. "Conversation?" she added. "I hear it's legal after midnight." A corner of his mouth lifted before he could stop it. She sat at the far end of the table, careful not to invade his space, and asked about the pitch deck he'd been tearing apart for hours. He answered with numbers at first, then with tone, then with a candor he hadn't intended to reveal. When she finally stood to leave, the cleaning crew was already vacuuming the lobby, and Derek realized 2 hours had passed without him checking the time. It unsettled him more than any failed metric ever had. They began staying late together after that, never formally, never scheduled. It just became understood that if the lights were still on past 10, one of them would find the other. Myra talked about things Derek never had language for. She wanted a home that sounded like something was always happening inside it, a place where the door was open more than it was closed, where people didn't knock because they were already welcome. She described kitchens that smelled like real meals and living rooms with mismatched furniture that had stories attached to every scratch. He listened the way people listen to foreign music, not understanding every word but sensing that it mattered. Once she told him she hoped to own a little house someday, not impressive, not large, just honest, somewhere she could come back to without needing a reason. Derek nodded, polite but distant, because ambition had taught him to pursue outcomes, not atmospheres. Yet he found himself replaying her words long after she'd gone, wondering why the idea of warmth unsettled him more than any risk he had ever taken. When it was Derek's turn to speak, he chose words that couldn't disappear. He didn't talk about comfort, he talked about legacy, about structures that would remain long after the people who built them were gone. He wanted to create something that couldn't be erased by trends or moods, something that would stand when everything else fell quiet. Myra listened carefully, chin resting in her hand. "You're trying to outlive yourself," she said once. He corrected her without thinking. "I'm trying to make sure nothing I build can be taken from me." He spoke about the company as though it were a person, demanding, unpredictable, yet worthy of absolute loyalty. He had already begun arranging his life around it, pruning anything that threatened distraction. Myra never argued with him. She only asked questions that lingered longer than answers. And Derek, who had mastered efficiency, found himself strangely comfortable lingering with her. They never fought during those early months. That was the first warning they both ignored. Instead, their differences surfaced in the margins, in the things they didn't correct, the silences they accepted too easily. When Myra spoke about visiting her sister for a week just to be near people who knew her before her resume, Derek smiled and said, "That sounds restful, the way one comments on weather that won't personally arrive." When he canceled dinner for the third time in a row, he didn't apologize. He explained. And she nodded, because she understood the language of being needed. But understanding is not the same as belonging. One night she asked, almost playfully, "If your company disappeared tomorrow, what would you do first?" He didn't hesitate. "Start another one." The answer came too quickly, as if he'd been waiting for permission to say it out loud. Mayra looked down at her cup, tracing the rim with her finger. She didn't challenge him. She only said, "I think I'd go home." The word hung there between them, home, carrying two meanings that would never meet in the same place. And still they stayed. The night before Derek flew out to meet a group of investors, the office was nearly dark again, the city reduced to a scatter of lights beyond the windows. They had been talking about nothing, a documentary Myra had half-watched, a book Derek hadn't finished, when the conversation stalled in that quiet way that doesn't demand fixing. She stood first, gathering her bag. "You'll forget to sleep again," she said. He shrugged. "It's temporary." She stepped closer than usual, not touching yet. "So is everything." Derek didn't know what that meant, only that he didn't want her to go. He leaned forward and pressed a light kiss to her forehead, a gesture so brief it could almost be dismissed, except neither of them did. Myra closed her eyes for a second longer than necessary. In that pause, a future tried to form. Neither of them noticed how fragile it already was. The studio lobby smelled faintly of coffee that had been reheated too many times and polished floors that no one was allowed to scuff. Derek stood near the makeup room while an assistant adjusted his lapel microphone, tugging at the wire as though she were securing a lifeline rather than sound equipment. 2 minutes, someone called down the hallway. His publicist hovered close, tablet in hand, reviewing bullet points that Derek had already memorized. Market position, growth projections, personal brand reinforcement. The last item was underlined twice. He caught his reflection in a mirror that didn't belong to him. Bright lights, smooth angles, the man who had learned how to appear effortless even when his body ran on caffeine and habit. The studio had a way of flattening people into symbols, and Derek had become very good at being one. Across the room, Mayra waited quietly near a rack of spare headsets, hands folded around her phone. She had come because he'd asked her to. Not because he needed support, he'd said, but because it was easier when she was nearby. The producer walked past, nodding approval. "He's gold," she said to no one in particular. Derek heard it and felt nothing. That, more than nerves, was what unsettled him. The sense that this moment, which others treated like an event, had become just another item to clear before his next flight. The red light blinked on above the camera, and the set shifted from preparation to performance without ceremony. The host's voice was warm, tuned to create comfort where none was required. They moved through questions Derek could answer with muscle memory: quarterly growth, leadership philosophy, the story of the first investor who had taken a chance on him. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbow lightly on the arm of her chair. "People admire your discipline," she said, "but I'm curious. Do you ever imagine yourself as a father someday?" The studio held its breath, though Derek did not notice. To him it felt like a pause no different from any other, a small detour from metrics into personal territory. He smiled, already halfway to the response he had rehearsed his whole life. He laughed, the sound polished by years of public appearances. "I never want kids," he said, as if announcing a preference for tea over coffee. "I'm married to my work." A ripple of approval moved through the audience. It was the kind of line that fit neatly into headlines, the kind that reassured people that ambition could still look charming. Derek leaned back in his chair, already done with the subject. To him it was simply another way of reinforcing the image, focused, untethered, impossible to distract. He didn't glance toward the edge of the set where Myra stood. He didn't see her fingers tighten around her phone. He didn't feel the shift in a room that had just rewritten the meaning of his life without telling him. From the narrow space behind the cameras, Myra watched the applause ripple outward, like a small celebration she had not been invited to. The doctor's envelope was folded twice inside her purse, the paper already soft from where her thumb kept brushing it. She had meant to leave after the interview, to catch Derek before he was pulled into meetings and drivers and flights. Now she couldn't move. The host had already changed topics, the audience already leaning toward the next answer, but the words stayed suspended in her mind, refusing to clear. "I never want kids." She searched his face for a sign he had misspoken, that he would glance back at her with the smallest acknowledgement that real life still existed beyond the set. He didn't. The studio was doing what studios do, producing sound, agreement, momentum. None of it had room for the future she had been quietly carrying with her all afternoon. When the applause faded, the room filled with movement again. Assistants crossed the floor with practiced urgency. A makeup artist reached for Derek's face to touch up shine. The host stood, already greeting the next guest. Myra stayed where she was. No one looked at her because there was nothing to look for. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She was simply standing still while everything she had prepared to say rearranged itself into silence. Her body felt strangely light, as though the air inside her had been traded for something thinner. She pressed her palm flat against her abdomen, not to protect, but to confirm. The proof was still there. The reality hadn't vanished just because it no longer fit. A crew member brushed past her shoulder without apology. She didn't notice. She had imagined this moment differently. Derek's face softening, his voice lowering. Maybe confusion, maybe fear, but not dismissal. Not certainty delivered with a smile. She folded the envelope smaller inside her purse and turned toward the exit. The hallway back there was narrow, meant for cables and people who didn't belong on camera. It felt right that she should use it. No one stopped her. Outside, the city traffic moved with familiar indifference. She stood on the sidewalk, longer than necessary, waiting for a sensation that never came. Anger, relief, even sadness loud enough to demand attention. Instead, she felt resolve taking shape quietly, the way decisions that cannot be shared always do. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. If you had been standing where Myra stood, holding a future no one else could see, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have confronted him right there, or would you have chosen silence the way she did? Drop your answer in the comments. Your perspective matters, and stories like this only grow richer when we tell them together. Myra waited 3 days before telling him, not because she needed courage, but because she needed space. A small pocket of quiet, in which the future could belong to her before it was forced to negotiate its place in Derek's world. She chose a Tuesday evening, the kind that usually dissolved into calendar alerts and hurried takeout. When he came through the door, jacket still on, she didn't ask about his flight or the meetings that had stacked themselves into his voice. She simply said, "Can you sit with me for a minute?" He hesitated, already glancing toward the kitchen counter, where his phone lay buzzing with unreturned calls. Still, he sat. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't soften the moment with stories or explanations. She placed the folded papers on the table between them, aligning the corners carefully, as though neatness might protect what they meant. "I went to the doctor last week," she said. Derek nodded once, his mind already categorizing. Checkups, insurance, logistics. She met his eyes then. "I'm pregnant." The word hung there, refusing to become anything smaller. For a beat, the room remained ordinary. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the familiar angle of light from the window. Then it changed, not visibly but completely, as though every object had been reassigned a new meaning without his consent. He looked at the papers but did not touch them. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough," she replied. He didn't feel the rush people describe in moments like this. No thunder, no cinematic freeze. What arrived instead was a tightening, subtle at first, as though a room he had always known suddenly had fewer exits than he remembered. His thoughts moved faster than he could arrange them. Schedules collapsed in his head. Travel routes, investor dinners, nights spent chasing outcomes that didn't yet exist. All of it jostling against a presence that would not be delayed or negotiated with. A child was not a project. It was not something he could revisit after the next quarter. It demanded permanence in a way his life had been carefully constructed to avoid. He stared at the table because looking at her meant acknowledging that the future had entered the room without permission. "This isn't what I planned," he said at last, hating the weakness in the sentence even as he spoke it. Myra didn't argue. She only nodded, as though she had expected nothing else. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but decisive, the way silence becomes when something has already been lost. "I told you," Derek said finally, his voice steady in a way that frightened even him. "I never want kids." Myra's eyes didn't widen. They softened. "People grow," she replied. Not as a challenge, as a fact. The words felt clean in his mouth, a declaration that restored balance to a world he suddenly didn't recognize. Growth, to him, had always meant forward motion. New markets, new goals, new rooms with longer tables. This was not forward. This was inward. Myra leaned back slightly, absorbing the sentence as if it were weight rather than sound. She didn't ask him to reconsider. She had already heard everything she needed. The room did not erupt after he said it. There was no argument, no raised voices, no slammed doors. Just the quiet recalibration of two people realizing they were no longer standing in the same place, even though neither had moved. Myra folded the papers again, slower this time, as if each crease were an act of closure. Derek watched her hands, noticing how steady they were. That steadiness unsettled him more than anger would have. "So that's it?" she asked. He searched for a version of the truth that would sound kinder than the one he had already given. None existed. "This isn't something I can do," he said. "I don't know how to become someone else." She considered him with an expression that held neither accusation nor hope, only clarity. "I never wanted to change you," she said quietly. "I only hoped you would want more." The sentence did not wound him in the way she deserved. It passed through his defenses like a statement of record, filed, archived, forgotten in the presence of the larger threat he believed he was facing. She stood, slipping her bag over her shoulder. The gesture was small, but it reorganized the entire room. The future that had entered uninvited now prepared to leave without a scene. At the door she paused, not because she expected him to follow, but because some goodbyes asked to be witnessed. "You're not wrong," she added. "You're just alone." Then she opened the door and walked out, carrying with her the life he had already refused to imagine. Myra did not pack everything at once. That would have turned leaving into an event, and she no longer wanted to perform for a man who had made it clear that some futures were not open for negotiation. She began with the small things, books she had brought from her sister's house, a ceramic mug with a chipped rim that had survived 3 apartments, framed photographs that told stories Derek had never learned to ask about. Each object went into a box with care that bordered on tenderness, not because the items were precious, but because they had been allowed to matter. Derek moved through the apartment as if through borrowed space. He noticed the absences only when he reached for something that was no longer where it had always been. The throw blanket folded at the end of the couch, the vase near the window that caught the morning light just so. "You don't have to do this now," he said once, not looking at her. She didn't stop packing. "If I wait, I won't go." The truth of that settled between them, solid and unmovable. They did not discuss logistics. They did not draw timelines or agreements. He watched as she placed the folded medical papers into the top drawer of her bag, not with ceremony but with intention, as though she were filing a future that would now be handled elsewhere. Outside, the city went on. Inside, the apartment was quietly rearranging itself around his refusal. The last box was smaller than Derek expected. It held things that couldn't be replaced. A scarf her grandmother had given her, the notebook she carried when ideas arrived without warning, a pair of worn sneakers that had walked through 3 different versions of her life. She sealed it with a strip of tape that stuck to her fingers longer than necessary. When she lifted it, Derek reached for the handle without thinking. Their hands brushed, not tenderly, just enough to confirm that distance had already replaced familiarity. At the door, she set the box down and slipped her coat on. The apartment behind them felt like a hotel after checkout, clean, orderly, absent of context. "I'll send for the rest later," she said. He nodded, as if this were a temporary inconvenience rather than an ending. She looked at him then, not with anger, not with regret, but with the kind of farewell reserved for people who will not be part of the next chapter. "Take care of yourself," she added. It wasn't permission. It was closure. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving him framed in a life that had already begun to collapse without noise. Derek didn't sit down after the door closed. He stood there, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade into the elevator shaft, telling himself that calm meant correctness. He had defended his life from disruption. He had chosen clarity over chaos. This was victory. That night he worked late, the way he always had after difficult conversations. He answered emails with surgical precision, rescheduled flights, moved meetings forward to fill the hours that now belonged to no one else. When he finally lay in bed, the other side remained empty, a space he redefined as freedom. He told himself that love was inefficient, that attachment was a liability dressed as romance, that he had done the only thing a man with purpose could do when faced with distraction. For a long time the story held. It held until 5 years later, when freedom would take the shape of two children arguing over a muffin, and he would realize that what he had called winning was simply a different name for walking away. In the months after Myra left, Derek's company crossed a threshold that analysts would later describe as inevitable. A new funding round closed at a valuation no one inside the building had dared to predict out loud. Offices expanded into floors that had once belonged to firms with longer histories and quieter endings. Derek's name began appearing in articles that no longer needed to explain who he was. He moved through it with the detached efficiency of someone who had already learned not to celebrate. Every deal became proof that he had chosen correctly. The absence at home translated into availability at work. He took red-eye flights without complaint, pitched without pause, built alliances that extended beyond borders he had never previously considered. When he accepted a major industry award, he spoke about discipline, about refusing comfort when growth was possible. He did not mention sacrifice, because sacrifice implies loss, and he was not yet ready to account for anything that didn't fit his narrative. From the outside, Derek's life looked like a series of wins stacked neatly on top of each other. Magazine covers framed him as proof that focus paid off. Conference hosts introduced him as a model of modern leadership, a man who had eliminated distraction in favor of vision. His calendar was always full, his inbox always overflowing with invitations that assumed his presence was valuable by default. Inside, something else was happening. He began staying in hotels longer than necessary, extending trips so he wouldn't have to return to the apartment that no longer carried the shape of another person. When he did go back, he kept the lights on, not because he needed them, but because darkness left too much room for thought. There was nothing wrong with his life that could be itemized, which made the discomfort harder to confront. He wasn't lonely in any way that showed up on balance sheets, yet when he poured a drink at night, the glass always seemed to fill too easily, as though he were compensating for something that couldn't be named. People assumed Derek didn't date. He did, just not in ways that required memory. There were dinners that began with mutual admiration and ended with polite smiles, connections built on proximity rather than curiosity. He learned how to be charming without being available, attentive without being present. Once, a woman he had been seeing for months asked him what he was afraid of, not in accusation, but in curiosity. He answered with a joke. It ended the conversation and the relationship at the same time. He kept choosing people who asked little of him, then wondered privately why no one stayed long enough to know who he was beyond the role he played. The pattern was clean. It did not bruise. It simply erased possibility through repetition. Sleep began to avoid Derek the way people avoid difficult conversations. He would lie awake in the penthouse with the city humming far below, his mind cataloging unfinished tasks that no longer required completion. The walls, once chosen for their clean lines and open space, now reflected sound back at him. A cough, a shifting sheet, the low mechanical rhythm of a building that never truly rested. Some nights he paced the living room with his phone in hand, scrolling through emails he had already answered, refreshing news feeds that had nothing new to tell him. He told himself this was productivity, that rest was a luxury he had outgrown. But the quiet was teaching him something he refused to hear. When every room answers only to you, even success starts to feel like isolation with better lighting. If you've ever reached a goal you spent years pursuing, only to feel strangely empty when you finally stood there, you're not the only one. Take a moment to like this video if you've ever chased something that promised fulfillment, and then asked you what came next. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. He was already late for a meeting 2 states away, already rehearsing apologies he would never deliver, when the dashboard chimed with a tone too polite for bad news. He ignored it for 10 miles, then another 5, until the engine began to shudder as though it had finally lost patience with his certainty. He pulled onto the shoulder with more irritation than concern, tapping his steering wheel while the car settled into silence that no amount of pressing buttons could undo. No service, no calendar buffer, just a stretch of road bordered by fields he couldn't name, under a sky that offered nothing in the way of urgency. He sat there longer than necessary, checking his phone again out of habit, then opening the door as though movement alone might restore order. The air smelled unfamiliar, carrying traces of soil and distance rather than exhaust and ambition. A tow truck would take time. He knew this. What he didn't know was what to do with the empty space that had arrived in the meantime. The mechanic's office was closed for lunch, a handwritten sign taped crookedly to the door promising a return that meant nothing to Derek. With nowhere else to direct his irritation, he followed the main road on foot, jacket slung over his shoulder, shoes unsuited for gravel. The town didn't try to impress him. A pharmacy with faded lettering, a hardware store that had outlived trends by ignoring them, then the cafe, the only place with light inside it at that hour, the windows clouded by steam and fingerprints that belonged to regulars. He stepped in without expectation, greeted by the tired chime of a bell and the smell of food that had been cooked without ambition. The counter attendant glanced up, nodded once, then returned to her crossword. Derek ordered coffee because that was what one did in unfamiliar places, then stood uncertainly near the wall, as though he were trespassing on something small and intact. He turned with the cup still in his hand, already planning where to sit, and the room shifted around a single table near the window. Myra was there, not the version preserved in memory, but the one shaped by time, softer at the edges, steadier in posture, as though life had finally offered her a rhythm that didn't require waiting. For a moment Derek thought his mind was correcting itself, filling space the way it did in sleepless hours. Then she laughed, the sound bending her forward, and the movement was unmistakably real. He stood frozen between the counter and the door, coffee cooling in his grip, wondering how a person could vanish so completely and then reappear in the most ordinary of places. She hadn't noticed him yet. He could leave. The thought lasted until the boy beside her lifted his head and looked straight at him. The boy didn't look away. He studied Derek with a seriousness that had nothing to do with manners and everything to do with instinct. His gaze was too familiar, the set of his brow echoing a version of Derek he hadn't seen since his 20s. "Mom," the boy said, voice clear enough to cut through the low murmur of the cafe. "That man looks like us." The words landed with no intention beyond honesty. The second boy followed his brother's stare, then grinned, as if he had discovered a private joke in a public place. He slid off his chair, planting his sneakers on the tiled floor, and circled Derek once before stopping in front of him. "You really do," he announced, "but taller." Mayra turned slowly. Her laughter ended not with shock, but with recognition. The air between them seemed to settle, as though the years had been folded neatly and set aside. "You weren't supposed to find me," she said. Derek's mouth opened. "Nothing arrived. I didn't even know I was looking," he answered, and for the first time in a long while, the sentence felt like truth rather than defense. Derek didn't ask for explanations in the cafe. He didn't reach for Mayra's hands or demand timelines that would have reduced 5 years to something manageable. He simply stayed in his chair after the twins returned to their argument over baked goods, listening to the rhythm of a life that had continued without him. He asked where they lived. She hesitated, then told him the name of the street as if it were a boundary rather than a location. That afternoon, he canceled his meeting for the first time in longer than he could remember. The call was brief, efficient, empty of apology. He told himself he could afford one deviation. What he couldn't afford was to keep pretending that absence had been a neutral choice. He returned the next day with groceries he didn't know how to select, bags cutting into his hands as he walked up the steps to Mayra's small rental house. The twins answered the door together, one holding the frame as if it were a shared possession. "You came back," Alexis said, not accusing, simply observing. Derek nodded. "I said I would." He began showing up like that, awkwardly, without fluency, carrying things he didn't yet know how to offer. He learned quickly that presence is not the same as usefulness. The first morning he tried to make breakfast, he burned the toast so badly the smoke alarm complained louder than the boys ever had. Fidel laughed so hard he slid off his chair. Derek stood there waving a dish towel at the ceiling, red-faced, while Myra opened windows without comment. He offered to help with homework and realized he didn't remember how long division worked. He attended a school event in a suit, because he hadn't packed anything else, then spent the evening kneeling on a classroom floor that did not care about his resume. There were rules he didn't know, about which cups belonged to which child, about the precise order of bedtime stories, about the way a scraped knee required listening before logic. None of this showed up on his old performance metrics. Each mistake was small, harmless, almost forgettable. Together they formed a language he had never bothered to learn, one that refused shortcuts. The question came when Derek was least prepared to answer it. They were in the backyard late one afternoon, the boys trading turns with a worn soccer ball while Myra folded laundry nearby. The air was warm, unremarkable, the kind of day that would never earn a photograph. Alexis stopped mid-kick and looked at Derek with the blunt focus children reserve for truths adults avoid. "Why weren't you here before?" The ball rolled to a stop against Derek's shoe. He stared at it, buying time in the only way he knew how, but nothing he had mastered applied to this. He could have blamed work. He could have told a story that made absence sound like sacrifice. But Alexis was not asking for strategy. He was asking for reality. Derek knelt so their eyes were level. "Because I didn't know how to be," he said. The answer surprised him as much as it did the child who asked it. Alexis considered this, then nodded once, as though the explanation fit into a space he had already made for it. Mayra watched from the porch, hands still, understanding that something essential had just shifted, not because the problem was solved, but because it had finally been spoken. The house had settled into its nightly quiet, the kind that arrives only after children fall asleep, not empty, but resting. Derek stood at the kitchen sink longer than necessary, rinsing the same mug again and again while Myra folded the last blanket in the living room. They had not spoken since Alexis's question, not out of tension, but because some words need darkness before they can exist. When he finally turned, he didn't begin with an apology. "I didn't think I was allowed to want more than one thing," he said. She didn't look up. He was grateful for that. "I was raised to believe that if you stop moving, you disappear, that people only stay when you're useful to them, so I made myself useful, all the time." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "I told myself that control was the same as safety, that if I kept everything in order, nothing could touch me. I didn't realize I was building a life that only had room for one." Myra set the blanket aside before she answered him. "You didn't just leave," she said quietly. "You erased us." The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. "I didn't get to be scared," she continued. "I didn't get to fall apart. I had 2 children to carry and no room to wonder if I could do it. You made your choice, and I had to turn mine into survival." She faced him then, eyes steady, not pleading. You don't walk back into 5 years of someone else's life with insight and expect it to weigh the same as what they lived. Derek nodded, accepting the limit she was setting without protest. "I don't deserve another chance," he said. "I just want to earn whatever part of this you're willing to let me carry." She considered him for a long moment, not measuring sincerity but endurance. "You can stay," she said at last, "but staying isn't proof, it's practice." There was no embrace to mark the moment, no promise of repair, only the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be granted. It would be built, day by ordinary day. The first time Alexis came home bleeding, Derek almost reached for his phone. Old instincts move faster than thought, document, delegate, defer to someone with expertise. But Myra was already guiding the boy to the sink, lifting him onto the counter with practiced calm. "It stings," Alexis said, his voice brave but thin. Derek stood too close, then stepped back, then leaned in again, useless in every position. He watched as Myra cleaned the cut, explaining each step not for the child, but for the man who had never learned how to do this. "Hold this," she said, handing Derek a clean cloth. He obeyed, pressing gently, afraid that pressure might undo something important. Fidel hovered nearby, narrating the accident with dramatic detail that had little to do with facts. Derek found himself listening as if this were the most significant meeting of his week. When the bleeding stopped, Alexis slid off the counter and gave Derek a careful look. "Thanks," he said, not as reward, but recognition. Derek stood there long after the boys ran back outside, cloth still in his hand, realizing that nothing he had ever built had felt as immediate as helping someone stand again. Derek learned to keep a different calendar. It didn't run on quarter ends or investor calls, but on spelling tests, field trips, assemblies where the chairs were too small and the applause came too early. The first time he attended one of the boys' school events, he arrived 10 minutes late and immediately tried to calculate whether anyone had noticed. Myra touched his arm before he could sit. "They don't care when you get here," she whispered. "They care that you're here." He spent the next hour watching Alexis stand on a low stage reciting lines he had memorized with too much seriousness, while Fidel waved at the audience every time he forgot his place. Derek clapped harder than necessary, his palms stinging, unaccustomed to celebrating effort rather than outcome. Afterward, Alexis ran to him first. "Did you see me?" he asked. Derek didn't say yes. "I couldn't stop seeing you," he replied. "The nights were the hardest, not because they were loud or chaotic, but because they slowed everything down." Derek had built his life on momentum, and here was a ritual designed to resist it. Pajamas folded in a precise order that had nothing to do with efficiency, books chosen for reasons no spreadsheet could explain. At first he tried to streamline it. 2 stories instead of 3, lights out earlier so everyone could be productive in the morning. It didn't work. Fidel would protest with elaborate logic. Alexis would simply go quiet, the way children do when they sense they are about to be misunderstood. Myra let Derek fail at this until he asked, "How long is this supposed to take?" She smiled faintly. "As long as it takes for them to feel done." So he learned to read the same pages night after night, to wait while Alexis arranged his blanket with geometric seriousness, to listen when Fidel added his own endings that made no narrative sense but absolute emotional ones. It was not efficient. It was necessary. Patience did not arrive as a revelation. It crept in unnoticed, disguised as repetition. He found himself waiting for shoes to be tied, for thoughts to be finished, for stories that looped before they landed. The waiting no longer felt like interruption. It began to feel like entry. One afternoon, he caught himself sitting on the floor assembling a toy that had already been assembled 3 times that week. The pieces fit awkwardly. The instructions were missing. He didn't reach for help. He stayed, and in staying he understood for the first time that trust is not built in grand gestures. It is measured in how often you are still there when nothing remarkable is happening. The question came at the edge of sleep, when defenses are tired and truths slip out without permission. Derek had just finished reading, his voice hoarse from trying to make different characters sound convincing. Fidel was already half gone, one arm thrown over his pillow, breathing unevenly. Alexis lay awake, tracing invisible lines on the blanket with a finger that moved too carefully for someone his age. "Are you leaving again?" he asked. The room did not change when he said it. The night remained quiet, the hallway lights still shining faintly beneath the door, but Derek felt something open that he had not prepared to touch. "I have meetings sometimes," he began automatically, then stopped. Alexis wasn't asking about logistics. He was asking about permanence. Derek sat on the edge of the bed and waited until the boy met his eyes. "I mean like before," Alexis added. "When you weren't here at all." There was no accusation in his voice, only memory preserved without judgment. Derek looked around the room. The posters he hadn't chosen, the stuffed animals he had learned the names of, the books he had read so many times he could recite them from any page. This was not a place you pass through. This was somewhere you remain. He didn't rush the answer. He didn't frame it as intention or try to protect it with conditions. For the first time in his life, Derek allowed the weight of a sentence to exist before releasing it. "I'm staying," he said. Alexis searched his face the way children do when they want to know whether a sound belongs to truth or habit. "You're not just saying it?" he asked. Derek shook his head once. "No, I'm not just saying it." Fidel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something that might have been a dream or might have been nothing at all. Derek reached out and tucked the blanket higher around both boys, the gesture small but precise, as though care were something he was finally learning how to practice without instruction. When he stood to leave the room, Alexis spoke again, his voice already fading. "Mom says people who stay are family." Derek paused at the door, understanding that the promise he had just made did not belong to words anymore. It belonged to time. "You're doing something powerful here, and the story is landing exactly where it should. Quiet, adult, emotionally grounded." Derek didn't announce his decision in a boardroom. He made it in the kitchen, barefoot, while Alexis struggled with a math problem that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with frustration. Fidel was at the table beside him, erasing holes into the paper, because the mistake had become more important than the solution. Derek leaned over the worksheet, then stopped himself. Not because he lacked the answer, but because he had finally learned to wait. "Let's take a break," he said. The boys didn't protest. They trusted him now. That was when it occurred to him, not as a thunderbolt, but as a shift in gravity. That trust was not compatible with the life he was still trying to maintain from a distance. Later that afternoon he stood in his office, the glass walls no longer feeling like achievement but separation. He drafted the message slowly, deleting more than he wrote, until the words settled into something honest enough to send. He wasn't walking away from a company. He was walking toward a life that had been waiting without him. The announcement reached the public before Derek finished clearing his desk. Industry blogs framed the decision as instability. Talk shows wondered aloud whether he had burned out or lost his edge. Investors released statements that sounded supportive while hinting at betrayal. Friends from his former life called in quick succession, each conversation orbiting the same disbelief. "You're throwing everything away," one of them said. Derek listened without defense. He had lived long enough inside other people's expectations to recognize the shape of panic when it didn't belong to him. When headlines began speculating about a hidden scandal, he turned off notifications and left the phone face down on the counter where the boys had been building a tower of plastic blocks. None of the noise could reach him there. The release didn't come with relief. It came later that night, after the boys were asleep and Mayra had gone to bed without comment, as though she were giving him space to meet himself without witnesses. Derek sat alone on the back steps with a mug he forgot to drink from. The house behind him carried the soft sounds of belonging, a floorboard settling, a distant cough from a child dreaming too hard. For years he had imagined freedom as escape, from responsibility, from attachment, from anything that might slow him down. Now it arrived as weight, the good kind, the kind that presses you into the moment instead of away from it. He covered his face with his hands and stayed there until the tears came without explanation. Not because he had lost power, because he had finally chosen something that didn't need to be impressive to be real. The backyard was smaller than anything Derek had ever owned, yet it held more life than every apartment he had called home before. Summer had settled in gently, the air warm enough to keep the windows open long after dinner. Alexis and Fidel chased each other between the fence and the porch steps, their laughter rising and falling with no concern for who might be listening. Derek sat on the grass with his shoes abandoned somewhere behind him, watching as the boys tried to catch tiny points of light that flickered briefly before slipping back into darkness. They shouted directions to each other that made no sense, assigning rules that lasted only until someone broke them. He didn't check his phone. The night didn't require documentation. It asked only for attention. Mayra watched from the porch, her arms folded loosely, not in defense but habit. She had learned not to trust sudden changes, especially when they arrived wrapped in grand decisions. She had lived 5 years without him, had taught 2 children how to move through the world without waiting for someone who had once promised permanence and delivered absence. So when she saw Derek stretched out on the lawn, letting Alexis sit on his chest while Fidel tried to trap one of the small glowing lights in a jar, disbelief came before gratitude, not because she doubted his affection, but because she understood its cost. She joined him eventually, lowering herself onto the steps, saying nothing, allowing the moment to exist without commentary. If it lasted, it would not be because it had been declared. It would be because it had been repeated. When Alexis finally collapsed beside him, breathless and triumphant despite catching nothing, Derek wrapped an arm around his shoulders without thinking. He had stopped translating moments into strategy. There was no part of this evening that needed improvement. Mayra caught his eye from the porch, a question unspoken but clear. He answered it not with explanation, but by staying exactly where he was, the grass staining his shirt, the noise of the world reduced to children in summer, and the choice he made again without ceremony. Presence, he realized, was not something you announce. It is something you practice until it becomes the only thing that matters. Derek did not think about that cafe often, not because it had lost meaning, but because it had gained too much. The chipped tables, the tired bell above the door, the way the boys' chairs had scraped against the tile, all of it had folded itself into the origin of a life he was still learning how to inhabit. Yet every so often, in the quiet between days that now carried different weight, the memory returned without invitation. He would see it the way it had happened, himself standing with coffee cooling in his hand, watching Mayra laugh with 2 children who had no reason to recognize him, only to do so anyway. He would remember the sound of Alexis announcing resemblance with the certainty only a child allows, the casual way Fidel had made space for him before he had earned it. It had not felt like discovery in the moment. It had felt like interruption, the kind that arrives when you have already decided who you are, and the world insists on introducing you to someone else. For years, Derek had carried those 6 words as proof of his resolve. They had been clean, efficient, impossible to misunderstand. He had built a career on the belief that clarity was kindness, that saying exactly what you intend to live by saves everyone time. Now he heard them differently, not as a statement about preference, but as a confession about fear, a way of announcing limits he had mistaken for strength. He had not been rejecting children. He had been rejecting a version of himself that required him to remain when outcomes could not be predicted. The words themselves had not changed. The man who spoke them had. Derek no longer thought of legacy as something that waited at the end of a career. It lived in interruptions, in the way Alexis insisted on explaining rules that no longer applied, in Fidel's habit of telling stories that bent facts toward feeling, in Mayra's quiet strength that had carried a family through years without asking permission from grief. He had once believed that building a life meant protecting it from disruption. Now he understood the opposite. A life grows when it is allowed to be entered, when control loosens its grip just enough for other people to leave their marks. The work he was doing now would never be measured by markets or headlines, and yet it would outlast anything his name had ever signed, because the legacy he almost missed was not something he could leave behind. It was something he had to remain inside of, every ordinary day, without applause, without escape. If this story touched something real in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that it's never too late to choose presence over distance. Let me know in the comments which moment stayed with you the longest, the cafe, the question, or the promise to stay. And if you want more stories that explore the choices we make and the lives they shape, subscribe to Mr. Cooper Stories so you don't miss the next one.